Everybody online has an opinion about language learning resources. In this video, we're going to teach you how to cut through all that noise and how to find your best language learning resources, and also teach you how to start thinking like a polyglot. 1, we're going to walk you through the core skills you need to learn a language. 2, we're going to show you how to find new language resources that don't involve a little green bird yelling at you. 3, we're going to talk about how you can learn how to learn. 4, we're going to teach you how to sharpen your language learning instincts so you can pick stuff that works for your personality. And 5, we're going to learn how to set a budget so that no matter what your budget is, you can find good resources. I know how to do this because I'm a polyglot, but I used to be horrible at languages. Not only did I fail out of the language classes I took in high school, but I forgot my own native language, which not a lot of people can say. And now I speak a bunch of languages. Turns out it's not that hard if you have a good plan and you have good language learning resources. I'm gonna help you find these so you can do awesome things with your language, like travel, or make new friends, or discover new cultures. So let's start finding you your new favorite language learning resources. Step 1, we're going to look into the 5 skills you need to work on in order to learn a language. First, there's listening. For me, this has been the most fun skill to get good at, and probably because of that, the easiest. Second, there's speaking. It's way different than listening. Think about it, even in your own native language, you might understand a word in context, but not necessarily be able to use that yourself, especially for hard or technical words that you don't use often. And that just shows that listening and speaking are different. Third, there's reading, which is again, very different than listening, especially in languages like English or French that aren't phonetic, or languages like Greek and Arabic that use different alphabets, or written Chinese, which doesn't use a phonetic alphabet. Fourth, there's writing, which is again, very different. And finally, there's the 5th skill, which is culture. Culture is what helps you do things like not be rude during a conversation, or understand a joke, or understand a little phrase that came from a TV show in the 70s. So we gotta work on culture too. When you're looking for language learning resources, you need to make sure all 5 of these skills are addressed when you're finding stuff and when you're potentially buying stuff. So I just need one resource to help me out with all of those things? Well, it's extremely hard to find one program that does meet all of those, although sometimes they do exist. So you're probably gonna have to vary it a little bit. That's why when I'm working with a language, I usually try to find 1 or 2 free resources online and then fill in the blanks with a paid resource. That way I'm working with 2 to 3 at once and I'm not spending all of my money. Some polyglots swear that 1 resource at a time is enough. And maybe for them that works, because we're all gonna have our own ways that we want to study stuff. But I personally find the perfect mix to be between 2 to 3 different things, so that way I'm not bored, but I'm also working on different skills. When you mix these skills, you can do one day where you focus a lot on reading and writing, which to me are a lot of fun, and then maybe another day listening to podcasts and working with a teacher, which is a little harder, but that way, again, like I said, you don't get bored. Now we're going to talk about how you can find some resources, but don't worry, we will get to budgets later. The second step for finding good language resources is actually not to necessarily Google it, but to talk with other people about language learning resources. If you're just Googling around, let me tell you the 5 keywords that everybody uses when trying to find language learning resources. Language learning apps. Language learning apps. Free. Language learning books. Language learning games. Language learning apps for 2020. The problem with this is that they're all setting you up to find the same resources, which are language apps and language books. But there is so much more out there. But what else is there? There's language learning books, but now we have language learning apps, which are better, right? Trust me, there are a million resources that aren't apps or books, and a lot of them are actually way more fun and way more helpful. So what's the secret to finding all these little niche resources? Find a polyglot you like and follow them. That's it. That's the whole secret. That's because everybody like me who speaks multiple languages loves to talk about languages. All we want to do is talk about languages and language learning. sometimes linguistics if we're trying to shake it up. And our friends don't want to hear us talk about languages anymore, but we want all of our friends to learn new languages. So instead, we'll just tell you about learning languages. This is why we have things like YouTube channels about learning languages. And we have Finstas because we love learning languages. I don't even care if anybody's listening. I'll just sit alone in my room and talk to a camera about language learning resources. And because of that, you have access to, forget some Google search, people who want to tell you about new and experimental things they've tried, resources nobody's ever heard of before, stuff that's passed through the language learning community by word of mouth. I recommend finding a couple accounts you really love who are learning the same languages that you are on Instagram or here on YouTube and seeing what they like to do. But then you can also just ask. Also, this is my plug to subscribe here because I have a ton of playlists about language learning resources that you'll probably benefit from. Plus, I add new ones all the time because, like I said, none of my friends want to hear this anymore. In this, there is a caveat. I will warn you against people who make a lot of flashy videos, such as how they learned a language in 5 days or even 3 months. A lot of us have products that we like to promote and partners. It's what helps make this hobby sustainable for us. But if you see somebody turning out video after video in new flashy ways that only their method will teach you something very quickly, or maybe how to bypass the hard parts about learning a language, they're likely selling you something. Accounts that tend to be more realistic and post things like StudyGram or progress videos over a number of months or years tend to use the products and then sometimes approach companies for sponsorships, etc. It might take you a second to kind of find out which accounts you really want to trust, but I just do want to add that because there's nothing wrong with having your hobby get paid for, but if you're only pushing stuff because a corporation is telling you to tell everybody you became fluent in 2 weeks, I wouldn't necessarily vouch for a product like that. This brings me to my third point, which is finding the language learning resources that work best for you. And now I'm not talking about I'm a visual learner because with languages, all bets are off. In school, we're kind of given these visual learner, auditory learner labels. And I've actually always been a visual learner. I actually went to art school. But it turns out with languages, my favorite language learning resources are actually audio. I've never learned like this in my life. But like I said, languages are a bit different. And that's part of the reason why learning languages can be super cool. You'll really get to know yourself in a totally new way. So how do I suggest finding out what kind of language learner you are? My suggestion is experimenting with very diverse tools and seeing which one works best for you in that you have fun and it produces results. I've basically finished Duolingo, so making a lot of progress. But here's the trap. Sometimes we think just because we are making our way through a resource that it must be working, or that fun and results are the same thing. Part of the problem is because, especially with subscription-based apps or services, they don't make more money if you learn the language, they make more money if you keep using their service. If you're having fun with an app and you progress through it, that's not necessarily the same thing as progressing with the language. And streaks really don't transfer into leveling up in conversations. So here's how I experiment with new language learning resources. I'll pick 2 or 3 new things that are very different. Maybe an app and a book and a podcast. Or maybe a new teacher, a new online program, and a YouTube series. Then I'll set a specific time frame. I personally like 2 months, but I've sometimes done just 1 month and up to 3 months. At the end of that time period, I find some way to test myself. So for example, Spanish was the first language I learned by myself as an adult. I basically used apps and I used a little bit of YouTube as well. Then to test myself to see how well I was able to understand or form vocabulary, I found little listening practices on YouTube with the answers built in, and I would just kind of see how I did. There's also grammar-based quizzes you can take online, but they don't necessarily test your ability to use the language, just your ability to gauge errors in the language or do specific things in grammar. this method worked okay to start. However, with French, which was the second language I learned as an adult, I started working right off the bat with private tutors. I did this because after Spanish, I had the confidence to invest real money in language education. And this was great too because I was constantly getting feedback from the tutors. So let's say we were working on clothing and food. I would then use maybe a resource for clothing and a resource for food and kind of just work with them. So then when I went to my conversation with my private tutor, I could see in a real conversation which vocabulary I was getting better at and thus which resource was working. But either way, the idea is experimenting with a bunch of different things and then proving somehow which one is working. You'll also be able to find little things doing this, such as which give you the best listening practice or which give you the most vocabulary, which explained grammar best to you. And like I said, we'll get to the budget soon, don't worry. You won't have to break the bank for this. Okay, so step 4, and this is a good one. To find your best language learning resources ever, you need to sharpen your own gut instinct. Eventually, you won't need outside metrics like a test or teacher. You'll know instinctively whether a language learning resource is working or not. And the only way to cultivate that gut instinct is to seriously experiment over time. When I first started learning Spanish, I spent 6 months learning solo and thought, I have this. I've finished Duolingo. I've finished Michelle Thomas. I'm basically fluent. That was fast. So on my first day in Mexico, you can imagine my surprise when I couldn't understand anyone. I thought I was doing so well, but I couldn't even order food. With the more languages I added on, the more I could understand if I was making progress or not. And I mean real progress. It's weird to explain this to other people if they don't study languages, but you kind of get this noise in your head and you can kind of feel the language like knocking around. And when you talk, there's a level of smoothness that you get. And then you're like, oh, okay, I'm getting this. So if you experiment long-term and watch yourself make progress long-term, you'll just have these feelings about it. And you'll be able to gauge whether a language learning resource is working or not. But it takes a long time to get there. And even when you do know, there's always room for improvement. So a few years later, when I cracked Spanish and French, I thought, now I have this. I totally know what I'm doing. Audio course, flashcards, immersion, boom, language learning solved. I'm gonna learn a new language so fast. So when I started learning German, I found out very quickly that my old strategies weren't going to work for this new language. But thankfully, because I had experimented so much with Spanish and French, I knew about all these tools. Now I'm still learning German and I'm still experimenting. But those experiments have actually become super fun and actually central to why and how I'm learning German. I have learned so much about languages and myself through this process that I've actually become a stronger learner in any arena because of it. And again, this is not only because I know all of the tools on the market, but I also have that awesome gut instinct. Step 5 in finding your best language learning resources is setting your language learning budget. If you've never learned a language before, you're not gonna really trust the process yet, and you're probably not gonna wanna invest a bunch of money in it. The good news is that you don't need a lot of money to learn or relearn a language. I mentioned my German before, and I'm actually currently in an experiment to see how much German I can learn on a $0 budget. And I like this because it's kind of a fun challenge. But let me tell you, it's way harder to learn a language on $0 than it is on a small budget. So now I'm gonna go into a couple hypothetical language learning budgets, which I'll explain in USD. And the reason this is important is so you don't get stuck at a plateau because you're not investing in yourself, or you don't try to spend all of this money to make a bunch of progress and waste all that money because you can't buy a language. So now, if your weekly budget is $0, no judgment. There are plenty of awesome free language learning resources online, especially for popularly learned languages like Spanish or French. But I'll warn you, a lot of free resources can be fun while you're not really making progress. Now, if your language learning budget is like $5 a week. That's only $20 to $25 a month and an awesome start. You can still take advantage of a lot of awesome free resources, but if you want to spring for a subscription or a textbook, you can. Now, if your language learning budget is like $10 to $15 a week, you're going to be really happy with that investment. That's enough to make sure you can buy good resources or subscriptions, as well as pay for like a half an hour or an hour of private online classes a month. That way you can have somebody help you if you run into a problem. Now, the next possible budget is $20 to $30 a week. When I've had the money to do this in the past, this has been awesome. You'll be able to afford 1 to 3 private classes a month, depending on what language you're learning and how expensive those teachers are. Plus, you'll be able to pay for additional good resources comfortably. You won't feel pressured to stick with one resource because it's the one you already bought, and you'll be able to try new things and experiment more. I will also say that $30 to $40 a week on language learning is luxurious. This is like drinking champagne with your private teacher once a week luxury. If you're an adult over 30 and you really just want to enjoy the process while an expert guides you, this is great. But it's probably not affordable for everybody, so don't worry if your language learning budget is smaller than this, you'll do great. Anything over $40 a week, in my opinion, is going to be a waste of money. You're not going to be able to use all those awesome free resources online, and you're probably going to be buying more resources than you can actually use in that time. Like I said, languages can't be bought, and you'd be better served investing more time in learning than money at this point. Okay, so those are my 5 steps, but because you've gotten through this video so far, you're clearly invested in doing your homework. So I'm going to give you a bonus. I'm going to give you 2 places online where you can find language learning resources for a variety of languages that are not just some random Google search thing, but actually recommended by real polyglots. The first is on my website, relearnalanguage.com. My work is primarily for people who are trying to relearn a language, but on the header of my website, you'll see language learning resources. These lists were put together by me, other polyglots I know, and native speaker teachers because we love them and they actually work. They're not just the tools with the biggest marketing budgets. Finally, if you want to see some in-depth reviews for tools that have a lot of languages on them, like maybe an audio course that's in German and Japanese and Swedish, or apps that work with 100 different languages, I have a playlist for that. Head over to my channel and look under language learning reviews. You'll find my favorite and most despised tools over there. And if you like this video, please share it with somebody who's maybe struggling with an app without making progress or doesn't really know how to begin learning a language. Now, in the comments, tell me what language you're working in and if there's any tools you want to see a review for. I'm building a big library of unsponsored reviews. I'm really passionate about languages and I would love to see what you're curious about. I'm here to help, so make sure you subscribe for future videos about different language learning resources and my reviews.